So with the surprisingly quiet and seemingly disappointing release of the new Suicide Squad game, I thought it'd be good to look over both Suicide Squad movies. So let's go straight into them. The first Suicide Squad movie was directed by David Ayer and released in 2016. Like most of the DC movies that came out around this time, this movie had a ton of hype behind it, mostly because of a really well-made trailer that really made it look exciting and fun. The downside is that the trailer was edited by people who didn't really work on the movie. They were making a trailer to try and make it look good, but they weren't necessarily making it to represent what the movie was. In fact, the original movie, when that trailer came out, was completely different. It was a lot darker, a lot more serious, and didn't seem like it wanted to be that much fun. But the trailer completely misled people in making it think that it was going to be fun. So they had to hastily re-edit the movie in order to kind of reflect that trailer, which goes a long way to kind of explain how this movie ended up like it was. The plot of both Suicide Squad movies are more or less the same, they just have a few details changed between them. So a group of supervillains are charged by the government to become part of a special task force, Task Force X, also known as the Suicide Squad, where they're tasked with going on missions where they're not expected to survive and it's too dangerous or too dirty to send in the actual army or government, so they're sent in and expected to die, but if they don't, they get time off their sentence. So it's very similar to the plot of Escape from New York, except it's a group of people instead of one person, and it takes place within a superhero universe. It's an interesting idea, and Suicide Squad as a comic has been going on since the 80s, so evidently it's proven quite popular, so it made sense to make a movie about them. The only major differences between the two versions are who's on the task force and their mission. So in the first movie, the group is made up of Harley Quinn, Deadshot, Killer Croc, Captain Boomerang, and Diablo, and they're tasked with hunting down the Enchantress, who was a former member of the Suicide Squad, but she went out of control, and now they have to take her down. So the first movie was a very divisive movie. I mean, both DC movies that were released in 2016 were, but the majority of people agreed that Batman v Superman was a bad movie. Suicide Squad, it was almost 50-50 at the time what people thought. Some people thought it was a fun movie and quite a contrast to the ridiculously dark and over-serious DC movies we'd had before, whereas others thought that it was just a complete mess and trying way too hard to be cool and edgy in its own way. I'm not quite sure how I feel, because I saw this movie in the theatre, and at the time I quite enjoyed it, but unlike the Marvel movies at the time, it's not a movie where I really want to rewatch it, or I think about how many things I remember from a movie, because I admit I remember very little about it. And as I said, this movie is basically completely re-edited from what it was intended to be in the first place, and you can tell the amount of editing flourishes and pointless graphical special effects in this movie are just off the wall. They clearly were trying to salvage a movie that was going to be dead on arrival, and I suppose in a way they succeeded. This movie definitely did better in terms of reception than Batman v Superman. It didn't get as much of a budget back, but it did do better in terms of how the public thought about it. But yeah, this movie just feels way too much of a mess for me to be able to call it good. I wouldn't say it's terrible, but I can't quite say it's good either. But there are a few things that are decent about it. In the first movie, that primarily comes down to three characters that have performed really well and are a lot of fun to watch, that being Harley Quinn, Captain Boomerang, and Amanda Waller. This is actually the very first time we've had a live-action version of Harley Quinn, and I'll admit that I've said this before, I feel that Harley Quinn's a little bit of an overrated character. She has a lot of fun elements about her, and she has been really good in the past, but I feel like the attempt to overexpose her over the years has kind of spread her thin, because a lot of her character is derived around who she's partnered with, be that the Joker or Poison Ivy. And just as a side note, with the whole her and Poison Ivy being a couple thing, I was a little on the fence about it, but I will admit it has actually grown on me. But even so, everything that Harley Quinn does is defined by who she's partnered with. She doesn't really work well on her own. And this movie is a good example of that, because they really define a lot about how her character works by either her interaction with the Joker or by the other members of the Suicide Squad. On her own, she doesn't really have a lot going for her. But I'll give her credit that she is performed really, really well by Margot Robbie, who is an amazing actress, and she does the role fantastically well. Admittedly, she has to do that kind of Boston, Bronx accent that Harley Quinn normally has to do, and she doesn't do it amazingly well, but she does it decently, and eventually you do start to see her as Harley Quinn, even if her character doesn't really have much to do in the movie. A lot of the stuff involving her backstory is quite interesting, though she is overshadowed by something else, which I'll get to in a bit. But yeah, she is a lot of fun, and I will admit that the costume they had her in was not a great costume, but I mean, everyone looks at Margot Robbie in the same way because she is unbelievably hot, so, you know, might as well utilize that. Captain Boomerang, despite being one of the more lesser characters in the movie, is performed amazingly well by Jai Courtney. I've always heard Jai Courtney's an actor that a lot of people don't like. I've not seen him in anything else apart from this and the other Suicide Squad, so I can't say much about that. But he is completely believable as this kind of scummy, degenerate mercenary who just does what he wants and gives no shits about it. He was a lot of fun. And Amanda Waller is hands down the best character in the movie, played by Viola Davis. She is totally believable as this completely amoral and self-serving government boogeyman who just does what she wants for herself and doesn't care. And she really has that forceful, authoritarian element about her that really makes you believe that she is this character, so I really give her props. The other characters, on the other hand, they just don't quite do it for me. Will Smith as Deadshot was a good choice, but he doesn't really bring anything to the role that he couldn't bring to any other role. It's just the typical Will Smith stuff. Killer Croc is really just a non-existent character. He really only exists to say maybe 3 words at a time, and that's it. And Diablo, even though he's got more of a backstory to him and they try to make him sympathetic, is more or less the same. And the Enchantress is a really boring villain. I'll give credit to the actress that a lot of people made fun of the weird way that she moved around in her performance, but I have to be honest, it did not look easy having to do that. Yeah, it does look ridiculous and it really detracts from her performance of trying to be serious, but you just end up laughing at her because she looks like one of those hula hooping girls you see on the dash of a car. But otherwise, yeah, I actually do give her credit to the actual effort she put into the physical performance. It didn't work, but you can clearly tell that she's trying. And yeah, let's get to the big thing. Jared Leto as the Joker. Wow, I have no idea what they were going for with this, but man was it miscasting. Jared Leto was one of those actors that when he started off in things like Fight Club and Requiem for a Dream, he was okay. He was kind of believable in his roles and he didn't get too far into it, but you could see what he was trying to do. Over the years, his ego has inflated massively and he's become one of the most pinnacle examples of a method actor who tries way too hard. He gets so into his roles that he basically thinks he is the character, which can help some actors, but he's clearly using it as an excuse just to be a dick to people, and that shows in this performance because I have no idea what he's doing. This just does not feel like the Joker. It doesn't even feel like a villain. It just feels like some lunatic that people are kind of giving a pass at because, like, I don't know, maybe they like him and they just want to try and big him up or something. But yeah, his performance was awful. But in a way, it's kind of entertaining in just how bad it is. And the biggest problem with this movie is that it just feels so cynical and manufactured. It was clearly made through charts at the studio by going, well, Guardians of the Galaxy is really popular, let's try and make our own version of that. Oh, we got Suicide Squad, that's kind of similar in the plot to that, let's do it like that. Everything in this movie, you could tell, was calculated and it was not thought of organically. And sometimes that can work, but yeah, in this movie it really needed someone who was a creative mind to take over and just weave the painting of the movie. Here, it just feels like I'm looking at facts being printed out. It's particularly obvious with how they keep having that jukebox soundtrack thing, which Guardians of the Galaxy did and it did well. Here, it's just throwing in random songs for the sake of it, and to be fair, they don't always have to be contextualized as why those songs are in there. But yeah, it just felt like a complete random jukebox set just for the sake of, well, Guardians of the Galaxy did it, so let's do it ourselves. And the result of this cynicism is that you don't really believe anything in the movie. You don't connect with the characters, the story doesn't feel believable, and it's just not all that entertaining. Like I said, there are a few things in the movie that are kind of decent. I mean, the visual style's mostly boring, but the costumes look really good, so I'll give it that. And I will admit some of the action scenes can be a little bit fun, even if they are done really shakily and very chaotically, which I get was maybe meant to be part of the point of it, but yeah, it's hard to kind of follow what's going on, but you know, sometimes they were a little bit fun. So I wouldn't quite say this movie is terrible, like I said, but I hesitate to say that it's good either. But in a way, it did help lead to some better things for DC movies, which is where we come to the next movie. Suicide Squad 2, mostly just referred to as The Suicide Squad, was made in 2021 and made by James Gunn. So James Gunn's actually the guy who made the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, but at the time he was fired from Disney for making some tweets that they weren't very happy about. So DC snapped him up straight away and basically said to him, look, the first movie was a mess, just do whatever the hell you want with this one and we'll just say yes to it because we're bloody desperate at this point. And in that regard, it actually worked out pretty well. So, like I said, the plot is more or less identical this time, the only difference is who's on the task force and what the mission is. So this time Harley Quinn's still there, but the other members are Peacemaker, Bloodsport, King Shark, Ratcatcher 2, and of all people, Polka Dot Man, though weirdly, he ended up being my favourite, but I'll get to that in a bit. This time the mission is for them to go after something called Project Starfish, which I don't really want to give away spoilers, but to be honest, I kind of have to talk about this. Was an ingenious way to bring in an old-fashioned and really classic Justice League villain, that being Starro the Conqueror, who is utilised amazingly in this movie. Beyond that, it's more or less the same, with just them going through the mission, arguing all the way, and learning how to try and connect with each other, and just going through the various misadventures of being a bunch of supervillains forced to work with each other to take down a threat that they don't really care about. However, this time it's done in a much more kind of fun, cynical way. So not in a cash-grabbing, we don't care cynical way, more in a sense of, this is my movie and I'm going to do whatever the hell I want cynical way, and in that way it works a lot better. This is exemplified best in the first 15 minutes where we're introduced to the task squad, but they're actually a different squad made up of different people than who was advertised in the trailer and on the posters. So there's a bunch of people on there like Michael Rooker plays Savant, who was also Yondu in the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, Harley Quinn's on there, as well as Boomerang and a couple of others. And they pretty much all get massacred in the first 15 minutes besides Harley Quinn, which was hilarious because it's not only basically them saying, yeah, the first movie was a mess, so we're just going to wipe the slate clean and start again, but it's also a great FU to Disney because some of the characters are clearly meant to be representations of the Guardians of the Galaxy, so it's just sort of like, yeah, screw that, I'm doing this now and I'm doing what I want to. So that kind of just sort of bluntness is ridiculously entertaining, and like I said, it really works for this movie. Also, this movie does not shy away from the gore. It's a hard R and it uses it to its fullest advantage. This movie is unbelievably gruesome, but again, it just completely owns it and it is a ton of fun. And obviously, since this is a James Gunn movie, naturally it's pretty funny. I don't think it's always that funny. I'm not the biggest fan of James Gunn's sense of humour, particularly the very improvisational kind of awkward conversations he does between the characters. Those, I think, they're not that funny to me, but a lot of people like them. But when he has like more sort of scripted humour or structured humour, they work out pretty well, and in this movie they do. The sequence where Bloodsport and Peacemaker compete about who can take out the most villains quietly and in the most gruesome ways they can is a really good sequence and a lot of fun. I also really like the choices of the villains they took. I mean, Bloodsport and Peacemaker are pretty typical gun-toting edgelords. They're actually done pretty well in terms of the characters, but they're not really all that different from the kind of people you expect on a team like this. But all the other characters are done really well. King Shark's the more simple of the characters. Literally, he normally only speaks one word at a time, and he's clearly meant to be this movie's version of Drax the Destroyer, but he's a lot of fun in just how simple-minded he is, and he's voiced by Sylvester Stallone, who does an amazing job, and it really is believable he's just this kind of weird, simple-minded monster kind of character, and he's actually really entertaining. Ratcatcher 2 I was a bit curious about, because I'm a big fan of the original Ratcatcher from the Batman comics. I think he's a really interesting villain, so I was curious why they changed it to be a teenage girl, but actually when they explain her backstory and you really get to know her character, who's this very sweet, kind of welcoming kind of character, very similar to Mantis from Guardians of the Galaxy, you really do grow to love her, and it was also a really nice touch that they had Taika Waititi play the original Ratcatcher, who was her father. That was an interesting thing. And my favourite, Polka Dot Man. Polka Dot Man's been one of those kind of joke villains in DC for a long time. He was one of the ones introduced in the Silver Age, where they were basically doing as much crazy stuff as they possibly could just to try and bring people back to the comic books. But he is a ton of fun in this. He's basically this very disturbed person who has these weird polka dots that he can shoot out that can sort of dissolve people. And it's revealed that he has this power because his mum forcibly basically infected him with an alien virus that made him like this. And as a result, it's given him a psychosis so that every person he looks at looks like his mother. Which sounds silly, but it's hilarious, particularly with the way they utilize it throughout the movie. And the way he's performed is a lot of fun. I admit when I first watched the movie, I actually thought he was played by Noel Fielding, but it's actually the guy who plays the Russian guy in the Ant-Man movies, but he does a really good job. Viola Davis, Jai Courtney, and Margot Robbie all return as their respective characters, and they also do really good jobs as well, even though Jai Courtney's only in it for like 5 minutes, but he does a good job while he's in there. And also, Peter Capaldi playing one of the villains, Thinker, that was a perfect choice. He is absolutely amazing in this role. He's basically just doing his 12th Doctor Malcolm Turner kind of performance again, but I mean, that performance is amazing, and he's the villain, so it works perfectly. So yeah, I'm really happy they had him in this movie. The only problems I have are basically two, and they are kind of major problems, but I don't think they ruin the movie outright. One is that the fact that it is still so cynical means that it's by no means as deep or nuanced or dramatic as the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. I'm always really impressed about how James Gunn, despite how much of a very contorted and debauched sense of humour he has, which makes sense because he used to work for Troma Studios, is really good at writing character relations and making us feel for these characters, particularly considering how misfit they are. Here, it's clear that they're not trying to make you feel as much for the characters, but to be fair, I don't think that's the kind of movie they were trying to make. They just wanted to make it fun, and in that regard it works, but I feel like they could have maybe done more to try and make us feel for these characters, and yeah, it's just like, they just come off as just sort of regular characters in a popcorn action movie, but that's not a bad thing, but I feel that it could have been more. The other one was Harley Quinn. Now, while Margot Robbie does do a great job like she did in the previous movie, her character's kind of pointless in this one. I mean, in the previous movie she had difficulties, but she clearly felt like she did need to be there in some ways. Here, you could cut her out of the movie and it wouldn't change the plot at all. She's completely pointless, and clearly they're just for fan service. Both in the sense of a character that fans will recognise, and showing her off in a very sexy fan servicey way. Particularly her feet. They really have an obsession with showing off her feet in this movie, and yeah, Margot Robbie does have amazing feet, and they've been doing that in a lot of other movies she's been in recently, but still, that's kind of weird. But then again, I have a thing for feet, so I'm not going to complain too much about that. But yeah, her whole subplot of kind of getting in with the dictator of the land in which the Suicide Squad are sent to is really kind of pointless, and then when that's over, she basically functions no role in this movie apart from helping to defeat the bad guy at the end, which, again, she really wasn't needed. Any character could have done what she did. She clearly was just thrown in because the studio wanted her to be there. But like I said, Margot Robbie still does a good job with the performance. It just feels like the character's a bit pointless. But yeah, this movie is definitely a lot better than the first one, particularly given that this movie did actually give me more hope for the future of the DC movieverse, particularly since James Gunn is now in charge of the movieverse, so maybe he might be able to take it in a better direction. It's still not an amazing movie, but as a dumb and ridiculously gory popcorn flick, it's a lot of fun, so I definitely recommend this one. But let's see what I get assigned to next time.